Welcome everyone to today's Tuesday Times Roundtable. Appreciate you being here for lunch as always. I'm very happy to introduce today's moderator, Adonia Simpson. She's the director of the Family Defense Program at Americans for Immigrant Justice, or AI Justice. Ms. Simpson has substantial experience in both private practice and legal services. She started her legal career as the fellow for the Center for Law and Social Responsibility, providing representation on special immigrant juvenile cases at Greater Boston Legal Services. During her fellowship, she also participated in a trial observation in Colombia with the support of Rights and Democracy and Lawyers Without Borders of Canada. Following her fellowship, she worked in private practice providing representation on defensive immigration and criminal matters. Before Americans for Immigrant Justice, Ms. Simpson was the managing attorney at Catholic Charities of Baltimore's Immigration Legal Services at the Esperanza Center. She has frequently lectured, written, and been interviewed on immigration topics and is licensed in Massachusetts and the United States Supreme Court. Thank you, Adonia, so much for being here today.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. How y'all doing? I'm a walker and talker, and I'm going to treat this a little bit like law school. I may call on people. I do want your feedback. I want this to be interactive. This isn't any fun if I just stand here and talk at you for an hour, so let's make this interactive, okay? So as introduced, my name's Adonia Simpson. I direct the Family Defense Program. For those of you, how many people have heard of Americans for Immigrant Justice? Show of hands. 2, 3, 4, okay. So we've been providing legal services to the most vulnerable immigrants in South Florida for about 20 years now. So that includes providing services of survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking, unaccompanied children, individuals who are detained in some of the detention facilities here in South Florida. And our Family Defense Program kind of provides general immigration services. And we also have a litigation department that's been pretty busy recently. So we do advocacy on the state, local, and national level. As you can imagine, things nationally have been really challenging for our office and for attorneys. So before we get started, why don't you guys tell me what's going on in immigration? What's been happening? What have you been hearing? What? It sucks. Yeah, I would agree with that. Things have been difficult. There's really definitely been a change in climate regarding immigrants, whether it's lawful immigrants or people fleeing, seeking asylum. We're seeing drastic cuts for refugees. We're also seeing decreases in student visas, people applying for student visas. We also see it impacting employment-based immigration. What else is going on? Oh, okay. What were you saying? Families are being separated. Yes, that's one of the things we're going to talk about today is the zero tolerance policy that happened a few months ago and why families were separated and what happened to them. So that's a really big one that's gotten a lot of national attention. And I think I saw a hand back there. Same thing? Yeah, so the comment for those of you that couldn't hear is that there's some people that are still separated. The children that are still separated, it's likely because their parents have been deported and they're having difficulties finding the parents. There's also a lot of unaccompanied children that are being housed in what's being called by the media tent cities in Texas and also here in South Florida and Homestead. There was another hand? Right, that's a really big one. It's about public benefits. And we're going to talk a lot about that today because there's actually been a lot of misinformation in the media as far as what that means and who's impacted. And it's a really interesting topic, and I believe that's the article you were all provided today regarding Trump scare tactics. Yes, so we're definitely going to talk about that today. Did I see a hand over here? Yes, ma'am.
I read something about decreasing the rights that the spouses of people who came here on an employment visa were getting, so they were no longer, like Obama's administration was trying to give them also work permits so that they're not just there, and Trump's administration is trying to take that away.
That's huge, and that's often one that I don't get when I do these discussions. No one ever really talks about employment-based immigration, and as a disclaimer, I do family and humanitarian-based immigration, but you're absolutely correct. There's a lot of changes regarding spouses of certain employment-based visa recipients as far as allowing them authorization to work here in the United States, and there's some litigation. There's a lot of things happening around that one. That one's a good one. Any other hands? Great. Well, we'll go ahead and dive in and start chatting about immigration. So I think first of all, before we kind of talk about what's going on, let's talk about the structure of immigration because it's pretty complicated. So not recently, probably a little over a decade ago, it changed from INS, which everyone always kind of talks about, INS, Immigration and Nationality Services, to the Department of Homeland Security. So the main enforcer of immigration is the Department of Homeland Security. So I don't know how well you guys can see it really well back here. Good, up here it looks a little blurry. So the Department of Homeland Security really has 3 sub-agencies that are in charge with enforcement of immigration laws. So the enforcement and also the execution of immigration laws. And all this is within the executive, right? So you have USCIS, which is United States Citizenship and Immigration Service. That's who's processing your affirmative benefits. So people that are seeking asylum, people that are applying for naturalization, family-based immigration benefits, employment-based immigration benefits, those are all getting processed through USCIS, or the service. The second agency, sub-agency that's really involved with immigration is ICE. And I'm sure everyone's seen ICE on TV. They show pictures, ICE police. This is the enforcement. This is sometimes what we call the police and prosecutors of immigration. So Immigration and Customs Enforcement, there are attorneys. So when we're in court, in immigration court, our opposing counsel is an ICE attorney. There's also deportation officers. Those are the folks that are checking in with people. And then you have the ICE agents that are going out and actually conducting raids or enforcement activities. So that's ICE. And then the third agency is Customs and Border Protection. So CBP is in charge of a lot of things besides immigration, including, goods that are coming into the country, people that are coming through a port of entry. But what's interesting about CBP, particularly for Florida generally, is CBP has jurisdiction within 100 miles of a border. So what does that mean for Florida? No guesses?
Well, we're a peninsula.
We're a peninsula, and border actually includes water borders. Right? So it's land borders and water borders. So the whole state of Florida is subject to the jurisdiction of Customs and Border Protection in addition to ICE. So I want to say, time kind of blurs together, so you'll have to forgive me. I want to say like 6 months ago, maybe you saw on the news that CBP officers were boarding Greyhound buses and asking people for documents, and people were being arrested on buses. And that's because CBP contends that they have jurisdictions within 100 miles of a border. And even though they're not inspecting people that are seeking admission or coming into the United States, that was their rationale in boarding the buses and asking for documents. So, and then in the corner, that corner over there, I put DOS, which is the Department of State. That's another agency that's really kind of sometimes involved with immigration, and that's for consular processing. So people that are trying to come from abroad, maybe they have a family member that's petitioning for them, and they're in their home country, they're going to have to go to the Department of State for an interview and do several things there. So that's generally the structure of immigration in a lot of ways, but we're going to talk about one more group, the Immigration Court. So the Immigration Court is within the Department of Justice. And unlike criminal courts that maybe you guys have seen on TV, like Law and Order, it looks like a court. You have a judge sitting at a bench. You have a trial attorney. You have your ICE attorney who's opposing a counsel. And then you have the respondent, who's the immigrant. What do you think? Show of hands. How many people think that that person has a right to an attorney? Okay. They do in the sense that, of course, if you want an attorney, you can have one. But unlike criminal, because immigration is civil, you're not going to get one appointed to you. So what's difficult about this is immigration, the burden's on the respondent to show that they're eligible for relief. So it's on the immigrant to say, I should be entitled to stay here. But immigration law is complicated. A lot of people compare it to tax law as being the most complicated body of law that we have here. So imagine maybe having little or no education, not speaking the language, being in front of a judge, and trying to articulate how you meet the legal standard of asylum, which we can talk about asylum a little bit later, but that's hard. That's difficult. And studies show that the likelihood of success on the merits of your case, actually winning your case and being able to stay here, increases anywhere from 3 to 7 times if you have representation. So that's why up here I put attorney ? Attorneys are expensive. So a lot of people, many people go unrepresented And it's really difficult to see. And nonprofits like ours have limited resources, so we can't represent everybody. So the immigration courts are within the Department of Justice. Does anybody have an idea what that means? Anybody? Okay. I'll give you a hint. That means that they're not independent Article 3 courts. Does that hint help? Well, that means that the person in charge of the immigration courts, the person that can make law, that can set policies, is the Attorney General. So you may have seen this in the news recently. The Attorney General has made several decisions that's really impacting the implementation of particularly asylum law. They've also put forth quotas, which say that immigration judges have to complete a certain amount of cases within a certain amount of time. Otherwise, it could impact their ability to keep their job or get raises and things like that. So there's a big movement right now to try to make the immigration courts an independent entity, kind of like the tax courts. Because right now, there's a lot of pressures from the administration, from the Attorney General, to conduct cases quickly, which is really impacting due process, the ability for an immigrant to really fully fight their case in front of the immigration judge. And it's putting a lot of pressure on the judges to try to wrap the cases up more quickly, right? So that's the immigration court. We're going to talk a little bit about that more later as far as the decisions from the Attorney General and what it's meant for us as attorneys and what it means for immigrants. So next, I think it's really important that we talk about the different types of immigrants, because a lot of times there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of people that interchange words, but let's talk actually what the spectrum of immigration is. So first, you have U.S. citizens. And U.S. citizens, it's important to note that U.S. citizens are not just people that are born here. You can naturalize. If you're a lawful permanent resident or a green card holder, you can apply. If you meet certain eligibility requirements, you can apply to naturalize and become a U.S. citizen. Also, by operation of law, some individuals that may not have been born here, but maybe their parents were, or maybe their parents naturalized before they turned 18, some people are actually citizens by law, even if they weren't born here. So that's a lot of times why you see stories about people that are U.S. citizens being deported. It's oftentimes because they maybe weren't born here, but they have a parent that was a U.S. citizen and they acquired citizenship by virtue of their parent. So we have U.S. citizens. Next, we have lawful permanent residents, or green card holders, as a lot of people call them. Despite the name lawful and permanent, I guess the bigger word is permanent, despite the use of the word permanent, it is not permanent. It is something that can be lost. It is something that can be taken away. So we're really pushing people, if you are eligible to naturalize, you should really consider it. So you can use, did you have a question? Yeah. Yeah, that's usually embassies are considered part of, the country, but in addition, being born to a U.S. citizen, acquired citizenship at birth, most likely. So despite the word permanent, you can lose it. So things that can make you lose your green card. Let's say you travel outside of the United States for too long. You stay outside maybe a year. There's a presumption that you abandoned your green card. So when you come back, they may try to put you in removal proceedings. You could be detained. Also, convictions, certain convictions and arrests can make people deportable or inadmissible to the United States. And it doesn't really matter how long ago it was. Recently, we've had a lot of clients that maybe had arrests and convictions 20 plus years ago, have traveled, never had issues, but now the biometric system, the fingerprinting system, has improved to the point that these things are being discovered, and then people are being detained and put into removal proceedings. So it's really important to note that even people that are lawful permanent residents, they can lose it, despite the name. So next we have temporary non-immigrants. So when it comes to immigration, there's intent behind it. There's people that intend to live here and have lives here, and there's people that intend to just visit here or be here on a temporary basis. So your temporary non-immigrants are your folks that are here on tourist visas or temporary work visas. There's this intent that, after they've done what they're going to do, they're going to return home. That intent can change. We've seen a lot of folks from Venezuela particularly that have come here as tourists, but given the circumstances in their home country, have decided that they want to seek asylum and stay. So the intent has changed. Then we have temporary protected status. Does anybody know what temporary protected status is? This is a big topic nationally, but particularly here in South Florida. Yeah. So there's 10 countries have been designated given temporary protected status. And so what it is the Department of Homeland Security makes a determination that because of either civil strife or natural disaster, that a country, people that are here and meet certain qualifications and have been vetted and make sure they are actually eligible and don't have disqualifying criminal convictions, that they would receive this temporary protected status. And what they're being protected from is removal. And there's also the benefit of work authorization. So Haiti was a huge one that got it following the earthquake. Temporary protected status was granted, and people have lived here going on, 10 years with work authorization. What do you think happens in 10 years? You're someplace 10 years. What would you do? Stay, maybe get married, have kids, buy a house, start a business. So yes, so temporary protected status has allowed a lot of people to really put down roots and start lives here. However, given the name, it's temporary. It's something that can be taken away. So recently, the Department of Homeland Security, in particular with Haiti, made the determination that country conditions have improved. That things are better, and people don't need temporary protected status. And so it's about, for Haiti, I want to say it's about 50,000 people, a lot of those people here in South Florida, that they're going to have to either find another way to stay here lawfully, because TPS doesn't provide a direct pathway to getting your green card, or leave. And that's a huge decision. And then some of the other countries that are being terminated are El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. So that's in total, it's about 350,000 people that have been living here with status, working lawfully, that are going to be in the really difficult situation of deciding whether they're going to have to stay and go back under the radar or find another alternative, or leave. So it's a really big issue. Particularly here in South Florida, that you've seen there's been a lot of litigation around it. So there's been lawsuits stating that the termination of temporary protected status for these countries was unlawful because they didn't really consider the conditions in the home countries. And given certain comments that have been made by the administration, the argument is it was terminated because of racial bias, racial animus, and not actually any improved conditions in the home countries. And also keep in mind, El Salvador has actually had TPS for over 20 years. So we talked about what you can do in 10 years living someplace. What about 20 years? Think about that, right? So next, deferred action, DACA. Has anyone heard of DACA? Some head nods, okay. So DACA, deferred action for childhood arrivals, is not a law. Sometimes a lot of people in the media talk about the law going away or the law being repealed. It's not a law. It's an executive order. So dreamers or young people that came here when they were children have been trying to we've been trying to advocate for them for nearly 20 years to get some sort of legislation passed that would provide them with a way to stay here permanently. And in 2012, following another failure of any sort of congressional action, what President Obama did is he used his ability to do an executive order. So it's not law, it's really just setting policy. But what he said is he set out these requirements and these guidelines, and if people met these guidelines, they could apply for DACA. So the action that's being deferred is deportation. And similar to TPS, the benefit that you get is work authorization. So it was huge. I think the estimates right now are about 700,000 to 800,000 young people have DACA. And as we know, this last year, the current president rescinded the executive order and made a new executive order saying that DACA wasn't going to be available anymore. And that's huge. That's 700,000 to 800,000 young people that are living their lives, working, going to college. And that's the thing. A lot of young people that have DACA didn't actually find out that they weren't documented until they applied for college. Didn't get FAFSA, right? But what's happened, kind of similar to TPS, where there's been litigation, there's also been a lot of litigation around DACA. Similarly, the argument is that they didn't go through the correct notice and comment and really put the public on notice before terminating the program. So what's been great is there's been decisions in federal courts in New York, California, DC, and surprisingly, from a very conservative judge in Texas, that is keeping the program alive for now. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We know it's going to go up eventually to the Supreme Court, and it's going to be a very interesting argument as far as the constitutionality of the decisions, and we're just waiting to see. So in the interim, there's a lot of young people that, between TPS and DACA, we have over 1 million people that could fall out of status and become undocumented. And then finally, we have undocumented. So first of all, I think it's really important, when we talk about people that are without status or undocumented, everyone imagines people crossing the border. Actually, the largest population of people that don't have status are visa overstays. So the folks that come on a tourist visa and decide to stay. That's actually the largest numbers. So you can become undocumented not just by entering and being here without permission, but by falling out of status. A green card holder that maybe loses their green card. A temporary protected status person that loses TPS. DACA recipients. When you lose that, you go back to being undocumented. So, and I think the estimates right now are about 11 million people in the country are undocumented. We already covered this. So this is what the definition of undocumented is. So you entered with a visa that's expired, you crossed without inspection, and this is, we were talking about the family separation. So being here without status is actually not a criminal offense, it's civil. Entering to the United States that's not at a port of entry is a criminal misdemeanor. So what drove the family separation, what caused the family separation is the administration's zero tolerance policy said if you are entering the country not at a place of entry, a port of entry, you're going to be criminally charged. So some people were charged with smuggling because they were bringing their family members, but most people were charged with a misdemeanor of unlawful criminal entry. Maximum sentence 6 months, and by the parents going into criminal detention, what happened is the kids had to go into the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services. And Health and Human Services, by statutes, in charge of taking care of unaccompanied immigrant minors. So those were the kids that ended up in shelters all across the country, and that was the mechanism that separated the parents. And it's important to note that many, many of the people that were entering were also asylum seekers. They were using international law to try to seek asylum from persecution and the harms that they were suffering in their home country. I think it's important to note that most of the clients that I talk to, that we have, their first choice wasn't really to come here. Some, yes, some people were looking for a better life, education, employment, but many were just looking to get away from what they were experiencing. So immigration is complicated because there's a lot of things pushing and pulling people to another country, but many, many people are forced to relocate. They're not really, it's not necessarily a choice that they feel that they can make. So, yes, sir.
I have a question. Under international law, when you're applying for asylum, doesn't it imply that that it's like state persecution? Because I understand that in these South American countries, it is like the cartels, and it's like a domestic issue. It's like crime, rampant crime. So like, where does international law like apply to that? Is it
That's a
still
great question.
government?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way the law reads is actually that it's the government or a group that the government is unable or unwilling to control. So as attorneys, our arguments are, a lot of times these gangs and these criminal cartels are transnational criminal organizations that are essentially running whole countries, and the government is unable or unwilling to control that. And so that's the persecution. That's a great question. But it is a big issue with a lot of the cases that we see because judges will say, this is generalized crime. I don't see an actual asylum case here.
To apply for asylum, you have to be in the country, right?
Yes.
So how do they enter the country? Let's say they don't get a visa, or I don't know, how would they enter the country?
So particularly this summer when we were seeing all the family separation, it was people presenting, they go to the border and find a CBP official and say, I want to claim asylum. Or they go to a port of entry, San Isidro, one of the places like that, and say, I'm seeking asylum. So they affirmatively ask for it. And then what happens, there's a mechanism at the border where there's something called a credible fear interview. And this is, we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but this has been impacted by the decisions from the Attorney General, but people have a credible fear interview, and an asylum officer is making the determination if you actually have a credible fear of returning to your home country, and if so, you go into the immigration court process, and you're able to fight for your case. If they determine that you don't have a credible fear, you're most likely going to be removed, receive an expedited order of removal where you don't even get to see a judge, and you're just sent back. So great questions. So a big question, and you'd be surprised how many people are actually surprised by this slide, that immigrants have rights. We've actually done trainings for judges on occasion, and they seem surprised that immigrants have rights under the Constitution. So it's really important, despite status, whether you are a US citizen or undocumented, there are certain inalienable rights that people have. You have a right to remain silent, you have a right to no warrantless searches, you have a right to a trial, and if you're in criminal proceedings, not immigration proceedings, you have right to court-appointed counsel. Also, education. A lot of people are surprised when people that are undocumented or not citizens or residents are able to go to school. So kids are able to go to school. There's a Supreme Court case that allows for that, to a right to education. And just general rights to due process and equal protection. So that's a lot of the litigation and a lot of the lawsuits we're seeing nationally about what's happening with immigration is in relation to that, as far as due process and having one's free and fair right to have their cases heard. So let's talk about some of the policy changes. So this is a lot of what you guys mentioned earlier, and we're just going to dig a little bit deeper. So all the changes in immigration really started about a year and a half ago. In January 26, right? There were several executive orders. So this isn't law, this is just changes in policy. The Supreme Court has long held that the executive and the president has a lot of authority when it comes to implementing and executing immigration laws. So the way that this is often done is through executive orders. So there was 2 big executive orders that came out in January of last year. And one was about the interior, which is this one. So just a quick summary. They essentially did away, before, under Obama, there was priorities. Because most administrations realize that with 11 million people here that are undocumented, there's not enough ICE officers or CBP officers or immigration judges to actually put everybody in process and try to remove everybody. So there's a lot of prosecutorial discretion. And so what happens is priorities are set. So under the Obama administration, there was priorities as far as focusing on recent arrivals, people with criminal histories, and folks with deportation orders. So that was kind of where their resources were being put forward. Under the Obama administration, there was the all-time highest deportations. So despite the changes in policy, there was actually a lot of enforcement happening previously. So the memo about the interior pretty much did away with priorities and said that everybody's a priority. It also called for increase in ICE agents. It punished sanctuary jurisdictions. So those of you that are from the area, you may remember Miami-Dade saying that they were going to comply with ICE detainers because they were concerned about funding being cut. So a lot of jurisdictions, that made a lot of local jurisdictions very nervous as far as working with immigration. And it revived something called secured communities and 287G, which was really agreements and cooperation between ICE and local law enforcement. So here's just a little old priorities and new priorities so you can see what it was under the previous administration and what the new priorities are. So essentially the new priorities is that everybody's a priority. So the second one was about the border. So this was the big one. This is the big announcement of the wall. This is the wall that's going to be built. This is also the expansion of detention. So we're seeing more beds being contracted. I'm sure you guys have maybe read a lot of articles about the private prison industry and how there's a lot of relationships in between that and immigration. There's a lot of money being made there as far as beds and detaining people. There's quotas for bed numbers as far as people being detained. So there was an expansion of detention. There was also an expansion of expedited removal. So earlier I mentioned if you didn't pass a credible fear interview, you could be deported without having a day in court, without having the opportunity to talk to a judge. So they expanded it to say if you can't prove that you've been here, so if they catch somebody who's maybe in the interior and that person can't prove that they've been here for over 2 years, they could be subject to expedited removal. That's really concerning because do you guys carry proof that you've been living here 2 years around in your back pocket? So as attorneys, it makes us very, very nervous. So some ways that non-citizens are vulnerable to being detained by immigration. We do a lot of detention work, and it's been interesting the last year and a half to see how the population of our facilities have really changed. 2 years ago, people in our facilities tended to be recent arrivals seeking asylum. Now we're seeing a lot more people that are long-term residents in our communities, people that have been here maybe 10 plus years, people that have kids. And it's tough. It's tough. And how do people get into immigration detention? Well, there's obviously like law enforcement stops. If they've had arrest, even if you're not convicted, that could put you on the radar. And because of the detainer policies in Miami-Dade, that's what causes a lot of people to go into detention, because the county will hold people until ICE comes to pick them up. There's a lot of logistics and specifics around that we won't get into. So we talked about the boarding the buses. So long distance train and buses are a place of vulnerability where people can be detained. Another big one is applying for benefits that you're not eligible for. There's a lot of fraud right now because of the fear in the community. There's a lot of people that are willing to take a lot of money that are not attorneys from people making promises, oh, I'm going to get you your work authorization, I'm going to get you a green card. So a lot of people that we see in removal proceedings or in detention is because they applied for a benefit that they're not eligible for. And then the biggest one is actually just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. ICE goes to enforce an arrest of an immigrant at a house and then asks everybody in the house their status, asks for everybody's documents, and everybody gets arrested. It's tough to see. So we already talked a little bit about this, temporary protected status in DACA. So this is what's happening with that. The programs are terminating, and they're terminating soon. So what's going to happen to these folks? Your guess is as good as mine. We don't know. There's a lot of movement in Congress to try to pass some sort of legislation that would grant permanent residency. But as you can imagine right now, there's difficulty in passing anything. So we're not getting too hopeful about that. Okay, so here's the other immigration issues that we were going to talk about. So family separation, we covered that. There's still, I want to say, about 200 kids that haven't been reunited with their parents, and it's because their parents have been deported. And that's really difficult to see. And these kids remain in the custody of Health and Human Services until a sponsor or family member can be identified and they can be released. What it's important to note is family separation is not a new thing. We'd actually been seeing this before the summer, not on this scale, but we had a lot of cases. We provide the legal services at the shelters for the kids down here in South Florida, and we've been seeing these cases for a while. But I think it got so much attention because it was so many in such a short amount of time. So the Attorney General decisions, there's been about 4 or 5 decisions. So as the Attorney General and as he oversees the immigration courts and the Executive Office of Immigration Review, the Attorney General has the ability to certify cases or refer cases to himself, which creates precedential decision. What's precedential? Anybody? No guesses?
It sets the precedent for other decisions.
It's binding on the lower courts. So it's the law that the lower courts and the immigration judges have to follow. So it started first, the first decision that came out was about something called administrative closure. It's important to note that I think nationwide we only have about 200 immigration judges. Don't hold me to that, but it's not very many. And the backlog right now in some places in the country, you may be waiting 4, 5, 6 years before you have your day in court. In that time, people's cases go stale, circumstances change, witnesses may no longer be available, but it really is because there's so many cases on the docket. So one of the things that the Department of Justice and a lot of the immigration judges were able to do is something called administrative closure. It's not dismissing the case, but it's taking the case off the active docket. It's taking it so no one has to go to court. They did this a lot with maybe young people or people that had some alternative form of immigration relief. At any time, either of the parties could move to put the case back on the active docket. But it was a great resource for judges to try to decrease the amount of cases on their docket so they could proceed with these other cases. So the first decision that we saw from the Attorney General actually said no more administrative closure. Can't do it, can't do it. So that's been difficult. So we're seeing cases where they have a form of immigration relief that's outside of the court. Maybe it's with USCIS or the asylum office, like when we were looking at the hierarchy and structure of the Department of Homeland Security. There's certain cases that the judges don't have jurisdiction and they can't decide. It has to be decided by another entity. So now we're having to continue to go back to court on these cases. The second decision was about, and this one was the really big one that you might have seen on the news. It was about asylum and survivors of domestic violence. Did anyone hear about this? What'd you hear?
Well, I heard there was kids that were getting raped, but I read this in an article online.
All right. So, there's a lot of misconception. People think that just if you're a domestic violence survivor in your home country, that means you can get asylum. Asylum law is super complicated and it's technical. So to win an asylum case, you have to show a few elements. First of all, you have to show that you're a member of a social group, religious group, political group, racial group, and for that reason, this is what they call nexus, because of that, you are being persecuted, and persecuted needs to be a little bit more than maybe being jailed. It has to be pretty serious. Maybe it's more than maybe being beaten up once or twice. It's looked at in the cumulative. And you also have to show, going back to the young man's questions back there, you have to show that it was either the government was the actor or the government was unable or unwilling to protect. So it's a really complicated set of elements that you're having to prove. And one of them, a lot of the cases are following into this particular social group. It's not because somebody was involved in a particular political party or had a particular religious belief, and that's why they were being persecuted. It's because they're a member of a social group, which the case law around this is incredibly confusing. It's incredibly dense, and it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It can't be too big, it can't be too small, there's all these rules about it. It has to be somewhat identifiable. So one of the groups that had been developed was regarding survivors of domestic violence, because in many countries, issues of domestic violence are something that are within the house, and it's not really the purview of the government to get involved in. And women are oftentimes viewed as property. And because of that, so that's the argument. The argument was that, because culturally, Guatemalan married women were unable to leave their relationships because they were viewed as property. That's the legal argument. Remember how we were talking about asylum seekers doing their own cases and representing themselves? Can you imagine doing that yourself? Making these arguments? So what the Attorney General's decision did is he really kind of stripped away this sort of previous precedent, a previous decision that was about survivors of domestic violence seeking asylum benefits. You can still do it. It's become incredibly more difficult. There's a lot more arguments that you have to make, and now you have to distinguish how your case is different than this precedential case that was set. There was also a lot of dicta. Dicta is something that judges will write an opinion that really aren't going to the issue that's being litigated. It's not really going to create law, but it's kind of setting the tone and sets kind of opinions on things. So oftentimes people cite to dicta, saying that dicta, that this is the way things should be done because it was expressed this way in the decision. So the reason this one decision was very, very concerning for advocates was it completely gutted the way that we do domestic violence asylum cases, but also there was a lot of dicta around government actors that suddenly, you have to show this higher level that the government wasn't able to control. And that also kind of put out there that gang cases, this wasn't necessarily a gang case, but that gang cases just really have no merit, that it's generalized crime and things like that, as you brought up earlier. So it's made it a lot more difficult. There was then another decision regarding continuances. So a continuance is maybe you're not ready to proceed with the case or something else is pending elsewhere, and since we can't administratively close the case anymore, we're going to want another continuance to let something else play out. So this decision was saying that the judges are really only going to give continuances in very limited certain circumstances. So for example, there's a visa for folks that are victims of crime here in the United States. If they cooperate with law enforcement, if they either cooperate with the investigation or prosecution of a case. And there's only, by statute, by law, there's only 10,000 given a year. Do you think there's 10,000 immigrant victims of crime every year? More? There is. Many, many, many thousands more. So what happens when you have these limits on the amount of visas that are granted per year, you start to get a backlog. So after you get the first 10,000, the people that are carrying over are going to carry over to next year. to the next federal fiscal year. And then once those 10,000 are used, everyone's going to carry over, and this backlog grows and grows and grows. So right now, it's estimated if I would apply for a victim of a crime here in the United States that cooperated with law enforcement, that suffered some substantial emotional or physical harm, it's going to take about 8 years to get adjudicated. So how do you think this is going to play out when I go to court and I ask the judge, I know you're under quotas and I know you're under a lot of pressure to wrap cases up more quickly, but my case is going to take about 8 years to resolve. Can I get a continuance? What do you think? No, right? We're going to start seeing this play out where judges are going to say no continuance. The judges can't adjudicate a U visa. That's done with the affirmative benefits processing, the USCIS. So the judge can't decide it. So the judge is going to say what we anticipate will start happening. The judge will say, there is nothing before the court today that I can approve for you to be able to stay here. There's nothing that I can adjudicate to give you status to stay here. So, any guesses what the judge says? You got to leave. Order an order of deportation. And the most recent case that was decided just a couple weeks ago was about something called termination or dismissal. So in certain cases, you can ask for that a case be dismissed. Maybe it's because you have a really great argument about pursuing benefits before one of the affirmative agencies. That's pretty much done away. So you combine these decisions, which are limiting your ways to get out of court, and then you combine it with quotas that are making the judges finish a certain amount of cases to be able to keep their jobs and get positive annual reviews. What do you think happens? I know you have the answer. You were close. Yeah, you got it. More people are going to be deported. Right? Okay, so that's the Attorney General decisions. He's referred a lot more cases to himself, so we're waiting to see how these play out. There's a lot about family-based asylum cases. There's a lot of different things there, so we'll see what happens. Next, the travel ban. I'm sure everyone heard about the travel ban. We had like 3 versions. It was a mess. People showed up at the airport in force. Ultimately, the Supreme Court decided that it was constitutional, but there's still been a lot of issues. Even though this hasn't been in the headlines and people really haven't been talking about it, it's still an issue because people from the countries that were identified in the travel ban oftentimes have family members that are trying to come lawfully through family-based petitions or maybe for business or for education. And a lot of people are now having to ask for waivers. And because they're adjudicated at the Department of State, there's no real appeals process. There's not a whole lot of due process because you're not in the US. So a lot of these waivers are getting denied, and I anticipate here in the coming weeks and months, we're gonna see a lot more stories about people abroad who can't reunify with their families. When we talk about family separation, I try to tell people family separation was a lot more of what happened in the border this summer. Family separation is what's happening at consulates when people's admissions are being denied because of the travel ban. Family separation is what's happening with TPS and DACA when people are going to lose status and have to make the decision if they're going to take their kids or leave their kids or stay. Family separation takes a lot of different comes out in a lot of different ways when we talk about immigration. You might have also seen stories about denaturalization. Stories about denaturalization. A lot of the policies and things that have been hitting the headlines really caused massive panic in the community. When some stories came about people losing their citizenship, and as an attorney, I advise people, I'm like, if you're eligible to naturalize, become a US citizen, you'll be safe, you can vote, you can travel, you're safe from deportation. And suddenly these stories hit about people losing their citizenship. It's important to note there was a lot of misinformation around it. People that lost their citizenship were individuals that maybe didn't provide accurate or complete, or maybe actually I should be clear, that misrepresented information on a previous application. So maybe there was a conviction or some sort of offense that would have made them maybe ineligible to get a green card or not eligible to become citizens that wasn't disclosed, and now it's being discovered, so they're going back and saying that that's the basis of people losing their citizenship. So we got a ton of calls from people that have no issues Most people don't have issues, and this isn't going to impact them, but it's really difficult to know, and this is part of the scare tactics, which go back to the article that you guys were provided with today. You saw stories about discharges in the military. There's also issues. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry to bug you for a second, but with the discharge of immigrants in the military, then I used to be in the military, and I had soldiers that were from different countries, and I pretty much helped them get their citizenships and whatever. My question is, once they get discharged and once they get sent back to the country, do they keep their veteran benefits?
That's not really an immigration question. I don't know the answer to that as far as VA benefits. The thing is a lot of people may not be deported that were discharges from the military. They may not be deported for that. They may have some other non-permanent status that will allow them to stay. Maybe they're DACA or TPS or something like that. I don't know about VA benefits. It gets complicated when it comes to benefits, as far as like Social Security and all the different types of benefits that people are eligible for. And I think that veterans benefits are very unique when it comes to people that can get it. So, you've also probably heard stories recently about a lot of the Iraqi and Afghani translators and people that were helping the military abroad are now being denied visas. I think this year it was just a handful of people that came in, where in previous years it was like thousands. So that's another issue that's happening that's not getting a lot of coverage. Sanctuary cities and detainer policies. We haven't really heard a whole lot about this recently, but you'll still see stories about certain jurisdictions or courthouses saying we don't want ICE in here. The important thing to note about sanctuary cities, I think it's become a very loaded term that carries a lot of, it makes people feel maybe extremely negative or positive either way, but ultimately if a jurisdiction says they're a sanctuary jurisdiction, all they're saying is that we're not going to actively cooperate with ICE. So if we have somebody detained at the jail that was arrested for driving without a license, we're not going to hold them for the 48 hours until you come pick them up. We're going to let them go once they post their bail. However, even in sanctuary jurisdictions, that doesn't mean that ICE can't enforce immigration laws. It doesn't mean that ICE can't do raids. It doesn't mean that ICE can't go door to door. It doesn't mean that they can't enforce the immigration laws. So I think there's a misunderstanding that if you're a sanctuary city, ICE isn't there and ICE isn't doing anything. That's not accurate. And then finally, fraud. So I hinted at this earlier. As you can imagine, people are terrified. And people are really willing to believe a lot of different things that may not be true. So we're really seeing the rise of notario fraud. And here, notary publics are not attorneys. An attorney maybe is a notary. But in a lot of Latin American countries, notarios are attorneys. They're transactional attorneys and can do legal work. So there's a lot of folks from Central and South America that think that going to a notario is going to an attorney and that they're getting legal advice, which is actually not legal. That's the unauthorized practice of law. And it causes a lot of damage. I've seen clients, I tell some clients, best case scenario, you lose your money. Worst case scenario, you get deported. And once somebody's deported, the likelihood and the ability to come back, it's pretty low. The one thing, kind of jumping back, and I should have said this when we were talking about the immigration courts, there's a judge out of San Francisco, her name's Judge Marks. She says that in their courtrooms, they hear death penalty cases in a traffic court setting. The consequences are real. Many, many people that get deported, it is a death sentence. Many people are being targeted because they've been westernized or because they think that they have money. For example, we're involved in the litigation right now with the Somalis, the 92 Somalis. Did you guys hear about this? The Somalis that they tried to deport and they were on the plane for about 48 hours and chained and not allowed to use the restroom and not given food. Did you hear about this? Maybe not. So they weren't able to effectuate the deportation. I think they got to Senegal or somewhere in Africa and weren't able to go on to Somalia. And so they brought them all back. Right now we're doing motions to reopen a lot of their cases, their deportation orders, on the argument that there are terrorist organizations in Somalia that will target them specifically because they are westernized, because they're maybe not practicing Muslims. I mean, there's a lot of issues there. So deportation really can be a death sentence. So in relation, and I forgot to put it on the slide, but in relation to the article you got today, it's about public benefits, and this is what I wanted to dive into a little bit more. This has been in the news a lot in the last few months, but particularly in the last week. So on Saturday night, the administration did a press release and posted a 447-page document about this thing called public charge. So when an immigrant, whether they're outside the country seeking to process with the consulate or they're here in the United States and they want to apply for a green card, there's certain things that are determined. You're determined if you're admissible to the United States. And so they're looking to see if you have certain criminal offenses or arrests or convictions that could disqualify you. They're looking for something, and this is what's in relation to the article, something called public charge. So if they think that the immigrant is potentially going to be a burden on the system, they could deny the case as being a public charge. So the way things work right now is the sponsor, the person petitioning the immigrant, does something called an affidavit of support. They have to show that they make a certain amount of money, that they make 125% of the poverty line. And it's essentially a contract with the government saying, if this immigrant somehow something happens, I will support them. And it's enforceable. The government can seek to get funding back on that. So what the change in the public charge regulations, which it hasn't been published to the Federal Register yet. So the process, the legal process in this is you make an announcement, you publish it in the Federal Register. There's a period of notice and comment where the community and the public can make comment about whether they disagree or they like, or there's things that bother them. And that goes on for about 60 days. And then once they review the comments, it becomes a regulation. It becomes law. So the changes, there's been a lot of misinformation around the changes because when there was a version leaked, probably about 3 months ago, somebody in the White House leaked the proposed changes. And it was horrible. It was horrible. It talked about anybody who had kids that were US citizens that were entitled to safety net benefits like Medicaid or SNAP benefits, that if anybody received benefits, not just the immigrant, but a family member, that they could be deemed a public charge and denied a green card. So that was horrible because how do you think people reacted? What do you think people did the minute that they saw this on the news?
Stop using benefits.
Stopped using benefits. And let's be honest, particularly, benefits for kids are important. We want to make sure that kids are happy and healthy and educated. So yeah, people immediately started disenrolling their kids from benefits. So on Saturday night, the administration put out their new version of the proposed regulations. And they took out the whole part about kids. And what's interesting is I've actually been trying to rack my brain about who actually this applies to, because a big misconception is that immigrants use benefits. Very few immigrants are actually eligible for benefits. The main ones are humanitarian-based immigrants, asylees, refugees, Cuban and Haitian entrants, survivors of trafficking, survivors of domestic violence. Those are people that are eligible for benefits, and guess what? They're also the same people that are exempt from the public charge requirement. So they list out all these benefits. So excluded are emergency Medicaid is excluded for people that have an emergent situation and get benefits. Excluded is disaster relief. Excluded is WIC benefits for women and children. And it really just applies to cash and food stamp benefits, non-emergency Medicaid, and a few other things. And I actually pulled up a list of immigrants that are eligible for these benefits, and it's actually, I can't really find any that aren't exempt under public charge. So it's a really interesting story, the way this is getting a lot of coverage. There's still a lot of misinformation because people are still kind of talking about the leaked version that happened a few months ago, saying that people's kids getting benefits are going to disqualify them. We don't think so. Another big thing that's been caused a lot of misinformation is people think it applies to naturalization. It doesn't. Admissibility determinations are only made when you're coming into the country or when you're applying for your green card when you're here, not when you're naturalizing. So even permanent residents now are suddenly afraid to get benefits that that they're entitled to because they're worried that they're going to lose their ability to get citizenship. So what's interesting about this public charge issue, I think it's very common with a lot of other things that we've been seeing in the media. It's scaring the crap out of people, right? So we're waiting to see how this plays out. It hasn't been published in the Federal Register. We anticipate it's going to happen this week. And we'll see what the actual final rule looks like. But it really has had, the bigger issue is it's had a chilling effect on people seeking benefits. People are afraid. And this is something that's been happening since the memos that I started this conversation with from January of 2016, 17, sorry. Is that because of the fear, there's this hope, I think, that people will stop coming. I think there's a hope that people will leave. There's a really big push with changes in policy and the way that the media is covering things that we see people every day that just give up. And they say, I'm just going to go back. So that's the public charge issue. So, getting involved. This was super depressing, right? There's a lot of stuff happening, and I hope that at the very least this has made you interested and want to tune into the issues and make sure you understand what's happening both nationally and locally. But if you feel extra fired up and you want to get involved, we do legal screening clinics, so free, or also alternatively, if you know people that could benefit from a legal screening with an immigration attorney. We do these events all over South Florida, and they're free. And people have the opportunity to meet with an immigration attorney and have their situation assessed and questions answered. We're always looking for volunteers. As students, this is a great way to get involved, get some experience, work with other attorneys. If law school is something that you're interested in, you get the credit for the, are you going to talk about that?
If there are global learning medallion students, I can definitely make sure that counts towards the medallion in some way. So definitely if you can start working with them, let me know so we can figure out how to
We love having students. Right now we don't have, I always get asked questions about volunteer, internship opportunities. Right now we have a space issue. The upside to all this craziness we've been seeing the last year and a half is we have seen some increased funding. So we've been able to increase our staff, which means that we have less space for volunteers in the office, unfortunately. But the clinics, we always need folks. And it's a great way to learn more about the law. It's a great way to get engaged and actually meet with people face to face, and not just talk about this like we're doing here, kind of about me lecturing at you guys about what's going on, but actually get involved and meet people that are in this circumstance. So this is the link, and we can email out to everyone that's signed in. If you haven't signed in, please make sure to sign in. We can email it out to everybody that's interested, and I can also include a flyer if anybody knows somebody that needs assistance. Questions? I answered all the questions.
Look, you mentioned how only criminal, cases are you entitled to appointed counsel. So since the administration is charging with this misdemeanor border crossing in order to justify separation, does that mean those people are now entitled to?
That's a great question. That's for the criminal proceedings, potentially. A lot of times misdemeanor offenses are exempt from the right to counsel depending on jurisdiction. But I know along the border states, a lot of federal public defenders' offices were providing criminal representation, not immigration. Because once they finished the criminal part of the case, once they either served whatever their sentence was, or none of the cases got dismissed because they're pretty much the easiest cases to prove because the person is here and they didn't have permission, right? But once they were transferred to immigration custody, they are then without representation. That's a great question. Nothing else? Well, I appreciate your attention, and your engagement. And I'll stick around for a few minutes if you guys have any questions that you want to ask individually. Oh. No clapping.
I have been doing some research about LGBTIQ refugees and seekers, asylum in northwestern cities. Different places. I studied some places in the United States. I have two questions. The first one is, how come the problem of the proof can be improved if it can somehow? Because it's really, you have to prove that you are gay, for example. Because if you are transgender, maybe it's easier to prove that. But if you are gay, or you are lesbian, or you are bisexual, it's difficult to prove. And well, there are some very disgusting experiences regarding this problem. You have to prove that there is a kind of persecution. No, there is persecution.
That there is,
you
yeah.
suffered persecution in your country of origin. This is the first question. The second question is, I'm new in the United States, just 1 year. I'm just starting to study some things that has to do with the legal system. But I have the feeling that if some of these aspects do not depend that much on the executive power, but on the Congress, things could be better. So what about this political issue? I mean, if the Congress do or they make a new law, wouldn't it be better? Because one of the things that I got in the interviews is that you told people are really frightened. They don't want to speak. It was very difficult for me to find some people to speak about this. And they say, well, 2 years ago we were okay, now we are afraid. No, we have another person in Germany that says, well, now everything is okay, but I don't know when the government will change and this will be done. The situation in Turkey is really interesting because with the change of government, they stopped their policies regarding Syrian refugees. Well, how can we make these situations to be more stable? I don't know.
Some great questions, and I may not have the answer to the second one. But in regards to asylum cases, I mean, imagine this: like you're fleeing for your life and you're being persecuted. Do you think you're going to have all this evidence of it? You don't, and it's very difficult. The way that the laws read is a lot of deference has to be given to the applicant's testimony. But then you have judges that are looking very critically, and if there's any sort of difference between the application or any of the evidence and what the testimony is, the judge could say, I think you're lying, I don't think you're credible. And that happens a lot, and those are really difficult decisions to challenge on appeal because there is so much discretion within the immigration courts. So LGBTI cases are extremely difficult. We actually just had one yesterday before the court. And this is an example of where like delays can really hurt a case. The gentleman was from Colombia, and 1.5 years, 2 years ago, Colombia passed a same-sex marriage law. Our argument was that the law is really in name, not in practice, that people are still, we had Department of State reports, we have all this stuff, we have all this information. Our client's been here 9 years. Any persecution he suffered was long, long ago. And the judge really became very critical of the fact of like, you don't know what it's like now, there's a new law, you're protected, you don't know that you can't go to the police, you don't know the government won't protect you, you don't know the government's gonna persecute you. So they're incredibly difficult cases, and we have to get creative about evidence. LGBTI cases, we may show evidence of, social media posts of people out at a gay club. People don't generally tend to post on social media with their boyfriend at a gay club if they're not gay. These are kind of some of the alternative pieces of evidence that we have to try to introduce and show. Because step one is actually convincing the judge that our client is gay, and then alternatively, sometimes we have clients that are maybe not out or maybe don't identify, but maybe they present very effeminate. So then our argument is that this social group that's being imputed on them because of mannerisms or how they're perceived, that they're going to be persecuted because they're gay, even though if they don't say they are. So it can get really technical. Sorry, that was a little bit of a rabbit hole. But asylum cases are very difficult because judges do want evidence, and 9 times out of 10, you're not really going to get it. So credible testimony is really important. Psychological evaluations are really important. Country conditions experts are really important. You're pulling in a lot of experts and witnesses that are going to kind of support the case. In regards to your second point, I think you're absolutely right. All these issues that we're talking about speaks to a bigger issue. The bigger issue is that in over 20 years, we haven't had any change in immigration laws, right? And the last big change that we had was like in '96, and it made immigration enforcement more difficult. So I think it speaks to the bigger issue that really to resolve a lot of these problems, there needs to be a general overhaul of the immigration system. It's outdated. It doesn't really fit the needs that our country has. What that looks like, I don't know. I think that national security should be concerned, but I think we should remember family unity and humanitarian issues associated with immigration. So I think ultimately, if you're concerned about everything, my message to you is, if you're a U.S. citizen, register to vote. If you're registered to vote, vote. Because a lot of the issues that we're seeing are really only going to be solved through congressional action. Because keep in mind, the president is in charge with executing and enforcing the immigration laws. If Congress changes the immigration laws, we may be looking at a very different landscape.
Now we can give the duly earned applause
Okay.
to.
Thanks, guys.
Produced by Academic Video Services within the Division of Information Technology at Florida International University.